Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. Olga Tokarczuk, Poland's most recent Nobel Prize winner, is our subject for today, and I'd like to start by looking at a passage from her first novel that achieved wide recognition, translated into English as Primeval and Other Times by Antonia Lloyd-Jones, who will be one of our guests today, along with Tokarczuk's other wonderful English language translator, Jennifer Croft. In this work, Primeval is the name of a village, not unlike the village in the Kłodzko Valley in southwestern Poland near the Czech border, where the author spends part of the year and where some of her other works take place. The village and its characters are referred to in terms of times in the work, which I take as a gesture to throw off our sense of time and space in the narration. This is from a chapter called The Time of Misha's Angel. The angel saw Misha's birth in an entirely different way from Kuzmerka the midwife. An angel generally sees everything in a different way. Angels perceive the world not through the physical forms which it keeps producing and then destroying, but through the meaning and soul of those forms. The angel assigned to Misha by God saw an aching, caved-in body rippling into being like a strip of cloth. It was Geneviefa's body as she gave birth to Misha. And the angel saw Misha as a fresh, bright, empty space in which a bewildered, half-conscious soul was just about to appear. When the child opened her eyes, the guardian angel thanked the Almighty. Then the angel's gaze and the human's gaze met for the first time. And the angel shuddered as only a bodiless angel can. The angel received Misha into this world behind the midwife's back. It cleared a space for her to live in, showed her to the other angels and to the Almighty, and its incorporeal lips whispered, "Look, look, this is my sweet little soul." It was filled with unusual angelic tenderness, loving sympathy. That is the only feeling angels harbor. For the Creator has not given them instincts, emotions, or needs. If they did have them, they would not be spiritual creatures. The only instinct angels have is the instinct for sympathy. The only feeling angels have is infinite sympathy, heavy as the firmament. Now the angel could see Kuzmerka washing the child in warm water and drying her with a soft flannel. Then it gazed into Geneviefa's eyes, reddened with effort. The angel observed events like flowing water. It wasn't interested in them as such. They didn't intrigue it. Because it knew where they were flowing from and to. It knew their start and finish. It could see the current of events that were like and unlike each other, close to each other in time and distant, resulting one from another or completely independent of each other. But that meant nothing to it either. For an angel, events are something like a dream, or a film with no beginning or end. Angels are unable to get involved in them. They don't need them for anything. A human being learns from the world, learns from events, learns knowledge about the world and about himself, is reflected in events, defines his own limits and potential, and names things for himself. An angel doesn't have to source anything from the outside, but has knowledge through itself, and contains everything there is to know about the world and about itself within itself. That is how God has made it. Primeval and some of Tokarczuk's other works, like House of Day, House of Night, have been compared to magic realism, in which a supernatural or divine world interacts with the world in historical time. The village of Primeval is guarded by 4 angels, and seems to stay in one place as history marches through it over time. Tokarczuk's work engages with a deep sense of Polish folk culture, paganism, herbal remedies, old believers and heretics, wise women in the forest, seers and visionaries, and she has a fascination for heterodox, or what she calls eccentric, points of view, and arcana like tarot, astrology, numerology, and Kabbalah, which might be taken as predecessors of psychology, which is what Olga Tokarczuk studied at the university before she considered herself a writer. Primeval was translated into English around 20 years or so after it was written. I remember when Olga Tokarczuk was in the US for a promotional tour in 2010. She really felt that she had written it so long ago, even though it was new for her American readers, it was so old for her that she wasn't so interested in talking about it because she had moved on to other works. But as a reader and a critic, I can look back at that passage about Misha's angel and see the beginnings of what she would call later her tender narrator, or maybe the sensitive narrator, czuły narrator in Polish, in her Nobel speech, which you can find linked in the bibliography on the introductory page for the episode on the Polish Cultural Institute New York website, linked in the YouTube description down below. Tokarczuk isn't the first Polish Nobel Prize-winning author to use the idea of tender in relation to narration. Czesław Miłosz, in his treatise on poetry, which is in verse and might alternately be called his poetic treatise, wrote in 1957, in response to Polish Romanticism, and now this is Miłosz's translation with Robert Haas, quote, "I want not poetry, but a new diction, because only it might allow us to express a new tenderness and save us from a law that is not our law, from necessity which is not ours, even if we take its name." I think what Miłosz here means by tenderness or sensitivity is a kind of openness to the world that isn't constrained in this particular context in the poem by rigid views of Polish national identity, not unlike Gombrowicz, who was doing battle all the time with the Polish emigre community in his diary. Tokarczuk describes the tender narrator as a, quote, fourth person one, and I'm quoting here, who is not merely a grammatical construct, of course, but who manages to encompass the perspective of each of the characters, as well as having the capacity to step beyond the horizon of each of them, who sees more and has a wider view and who is able to ignore time. Going on. Seeing everything also means a completely different kind of responsibility for the world, because it becomes obvious that every gesture here is connected to a gesture there, that a decision taken in one part of the world will have effects in another part of it, and that differentiating between mine and yours starts to be debatable. And then later on she says, tenderness is spontaneous and disinterested. It goes far beyond empathetic fellow feeling. Instead, it is the conscious, though perhaps slightly melancholy, common sharing of fate. Tokarczuk's tender narrator is not exactly omniscient, though omniscient narrators aren't all the same either. Some can observe everything, while others are psychologically omniscient, knowing the character's thoughts, sometimes even slipping into the consciousness of a dog or a horse, like in Turgenev or Tolstoy. The tender narrator is far-seeing, panoptic, able to comprehend the past, present, and future at once, maybe like the Hasidic mystic Rabbi Yaakov Yitzchak Halevi Horowitz, the seer of Lublin, whose life overlapped with that of Jacob Frank, the subject of Tokarczuk's magnum opus, The Books of Jacob, which we'll be discussing today with its translator, Jennifer Croft. Now, I realize that Olga Tokarczuk is a controversial figure in the Polish community because of her outspoken views about women's rights, animal rights, the Polish Catholic Church, and a certain conception of Polish national identity. So if you're not a fan and you don't want to read along with us and find out some of what makes her text interesting to readers both in Polish and in the more than 35 languages into which her work has been translated, then I'm sure you'll find some of our other episodes about Polish literature more interesting. But the academic study of literature really isn't about what or who we like or don't like. It's about what texts mean and where they fit in a broader literary and cultural context. Maybe personally, there are some things I'd rather spend my time on than others, but ultimately, I believe there are no uninteresting texts, only uninteresting readers. And if you come to a text with an open mind and some familiarity with a few different reading strategies, then you can find something worth discussing, whether you like the work or the author or not. Before we meet today's guests, I'd like to thank everyone who has been following along with Encounters with Polish Literature and to welcome newcomers to our series. If you like what you hear on this program, click the thumbs up down below. Ring the bell to get notifications about new episodes, And follow the playlist of all of our episodes in the YouTube description of the program down below, and leave a comment if you can. And please click the subscribe button to show the Polish Cultural Institute New York that you are interested and would like to hear more about Polish literature, its past and present, here on Encounters with Polish Literature. So our guests. Jennifer Croft won the 2020 William Saroyan International Prize for writing for her illustrated memoir, Homesick, and she won the 2018 Man Booker International Prize for her translation from Polish of Nobel laureate Olga Tokarczuk's Flights. She is also the author of Serpientes y Escaleras and Notes on Postcards, and the translator of Federico Falco's A Perfect Cemetery, Romina Paula's August, Pedro Mayral's The Woman from Uruguay, and Olga Tokarczuk's The Books of Jacob. She holds a PhD from Northwestern University and an MFA from the University of Iowa, and is currently visiting assistant professor in creative writing at the University of Arkansas. Our other guest today, Antonia Lloyd-Jones, has translated works by several of Poland's leading contemporary novelists and reportage authors, as well as crime fiction, screenplays, poetry, and children's books. Her translation of Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk was shortlisted for the 2019 Man Booker International Prize. In 2018, she was awarded the Transatlantic Prize for the Best Promoter of Polish Literature Abroad. She is a regular mentor for the Emerging Translators Mentorship Program and a former co-chair of the UK Translators Association. Antonia and Jenny, welcome to the program. It's great to see you here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Antonia, you've known Olga the longest. So maybe you can say, how did you first meet? How did you come to translate her work? Did you know her before you started translating, or the other way around?
Well, I met her somewhere in the fairly early 1990s through her then agent and friend, who is a Dutch publisher called Adriaan van Rijsewijk, whose wife is Polish, and they're very good friends of Olga's, and they have a house quite near hers in Kotlina Kłodzka in southwestern Poland, where some of the books are set. And he had invited me to come and stay during the summer. I was already a translator, but I hadn't done a great deal at that point. I still had sensible jobs in those days. I was working at the European Bank. And so I thought, great, I'd love to go to this part of Poland again, a part I knew from many years earlier. But when I arrived, it turned out that Adriaan's house was still being built and there was nowhere to stay. So he took me to Olga's house, which is the house in Dom Dzienny, Dom Nocny, which much later on I did translate. And
House of Day, House of Night for our audience.
Yes, House of Day, House of Night. And I arrived and Lufthansa had lost my luggage. So I was traveling in Europe for about 6 weeks and had nothing. And I arrived at Olga's house. And as soon as I crossed the threshold, she handed me a toothbrush, a pair of pajamas, and the history of this has never fully been untangled. A packet of paper throwaway knickers, panties, you would say, in the US. And she can't think how she had them, but she did. And her house was amazing because this house, which they had rebuilt this old German farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, at the edge of the village. It's a wonderful place. And they had people staying always in the summer, and the house was full. So that first time I actually stayed with some neighbors. But I went back every summer after that. And I think someone was already translating Olga's work into English. There wasn't really a need for an English language translator. So we started off just making friends. And then Adriaan managed to persuade Granta, the British publisher, to publish one of Olga's books. And it was a kind of a toss-up between Primeval and Other Times and House of Day, House of Night. And I thought really they should have started with Primeval, which is in some ways a more accessible book than House of Day, House of Night. But they chose to publish that one first, and they asked me to translate it because I was recommended by her then agent. So that's how I started translating her work.
And Jenny, how about you? How did you start translating Olga Tokarczuk?
Well, I came across Olga about a decade later in the University of Iowa library. So I went to the University of Iowa to do a Master's of Fine Arts and Literary Translation in Russian. And there was a weird coup in the Slavic department a couple of weeks before classes began. And I was left with Polish as the only Slavic language they were offering. And I didn't really know what Poland was, but I decided I had no other option. So I started studying Polish and I started kind of looking around. I had already committed by that point to translating contemporary women writers. That's what I wanted to do. And Olga, I first found Hannah Krall, and then Olga had just published her 2001 collection of short stories. And I found that in the library. And then I also did some research and I found very quickly Antonia, who was translating Olga. So I sent an email. I don't remember how I got your contact, Antonia, but
Claire? I don't know.
Maybe. Claire Kavanagh was my advisor at Northwestern, though, so maybe not.
It was later.
Yeah, I don't remember how I found you, but I stalked you on the internet, obviously, and I found you. And I asked you if you were planning to translate everything or if there was anything I might be able to translate. This is as I recall it, because I don't have access to these emails from Iowa anymore. But I remember that you were so generous and supportive and, very willing to share and to even read my drafts of Olga's short stories, which I think I sent you two. And then you were the one who put me in touch with Olga when Bikuni came out in 2007, which I translated as Flights. And that's when at that point, I met her in Krakow in Poland in 2007.
Yes, because you sent me your drafts and I had translated House of Day, House of Night, but with a lot of trepidation. I'd still love to revisit that translation. It could do with improvement, to my mind. And so I just was very impressed by your work. And I thought, this is someone to encourage. I'm not that mega experienced myself. And I thought it would be great to have somebody to team up with too on this. And then we met fairly soon after, I think, at a Polish Studies conference that Bill Johnston had organized in Bloomington.
Yeah.
And we just hit it off and had so much in common and to share. And it was just a delight for me. So I've always been very pleased that to have a fellow translator. I wouldn't say we're co-translators because we don't work together. We leave each other in peace.
And we have very different styles too, but it has ended up being so wonderful to have this team, especially as, Olga has become better known recently. It's been so great not to have to do everything on our own, and it takes a lot of the pressure off. And it's also just nice to have someone to talk to about the things that we're working on and working through. So it's been really great.
Oh, it's lovely. And I think it's very interesting that a writer like Olga, and this is true of several of the languages that she's translated into, has more than one translator in several cases. And I think this is partly a reflection of the sort of a writer she is, because no two books are really the same. She's someone who reinvents herself, who loves to rip up convention and find a new way of presenting a novel. You never know quite what to expect. She likes kind of bucking the trend and playing around with genres. So it seems to me quite natural that she might have translators who come from different places, different kind of sensibilities, and with different experience. It makes sense.
I'm always curious as to how involved the author is in the translation, and has that changed since Olga's English has developed over years? And she talks about in one of the works that I'd like to discuss today, "Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead," translating Blake together. Dusheko, the character, talks about translating Blake with Dizzy together. Does Olga look over your shoulder, or does she leave you to yourself, or does she read the drafts? How involved is she?
Well, the only involvement she's had in my translations is when I have questions for her, which I save up with every writer till the end of my translation, because obviously a lot of my questions get resolved along the way, and I don't want to burden an author with an awful lot of silly things that I can find out for myself. But I have, and it's quite funny because I will quite often, my question will be, what exactly do you mean here? I don't quite see where this is going. And she'll say, oh, that's my poetry. And I'll say, well, Olga, it has to mean something. It's very hard for a translator if something just, they don't understand exactly what you're trying to say. And she can't really explain it. And that could be slightly alarming. But she doesn't interfere in the translations. And she usually says that she trusts her translators partly because she has to. And even as her English has become more competent, she has essentially respected our craft and our ability and left us to do it. I think one thing is she was quite specific sometimes about which of us should translate what. And that's kind of always worked out naturally anyway. So I know that Jennifer is by far the more natural translator for Bieguni, for flights, than I would ever have been. I wasn't so happy with that book. And then I'm possibly the more natural translator for Drive Your Plow, because I'm a kind of proto-Dusheko type. I'm going to be her when I grow up. And then Olga was quite specific about the books of Jacob. When it was first out, I was thinking, oh my God, I don't want to have to translate this huge thing. And Jennifer was very keen. And I did sort of out of politeness say, well, if you needed a co-translator or if it needed to be done by two people, I suppose I could. And Olga said, no, Jennifer's going to translate this. And there was quite a lot of relief in my mind.
Jenny, how about with you? Has she been looking over your shoulder on the works you've translated?
She never has, no. And I think it has to do with, of course, what Antonia mentioned about trusting her translators and really having a very clear and wonderful vision of what translation is, which I think all of us who translate her so appreciate, because there are so many people in the literary industry, so to speak, who do not respect our work. And Olga is absolutely not like that. But I also think it has to do with something Antonia said earlier about how each of Olga's books is so different. And it seems to me that once she's finished with something, she is finished and she's ready to move on to the next thing. And so by the time you ask questions, she really genuinely doesn't remember. She does not remember that book anymore. That came up a lot when people are now talking about the massive delay between the Polish publication of the books of Jacob in 2015 and the English language publication today. But there was a bigger gap between the Polish publication of Bieguni and the English language publication of Flights. And by the time we were talking about that to English readers, she really had no idea how to answer people's questions from the audience, too. She just didn't remember writing that book. She had written several since then. So I think it has to do with a variety of factors, but she definitely doesn't look over my shoulder either.
That's very interesting. And I also think it's interesting in the way that she thematizes translation in the work. Of course, in Drive Your Plow, you have the translation of Blake. That's part of the process. The translation has become, something she writes about because it's something that she experiences. And also, the position of Molivda in the books of Jacob as the intermediary, in a sense, the most important person, who's like the link between Jacob and Jacob, the Polish church, the Polish Jews who don't necessarily speak Turkish, and he who doesn't speak Yiddish so much. So maybe what's your sense of how that's become a theme? Jenny, if you want to start, maybe.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about. Molivda is a very tricky character in the books of Jacob. He is the interpreter for Jacob Frank and his followers. But he does betray them in the classic translator betrayer kind of formulation. None of her characters is a caricature ever, and he has, his own struggles and he's torn by many factors, but he does betray the people that he's supposed to be helping communicate. So maybe that's why she wanted me to translate it, Antonia. Maybe I'm the Molly. I don't know.
What do you think about Drive Your Plow and translation as a topic in itself?
Well, it was the Blake theme is really because Olga is a great fan of Blake, and the quotations that start each chapter, they're mostly from the Proverbs of Heaven and Hell and the songs of I'm just going to find the Auguries of Innocence, Proverbs of Hell, and The Mental Traveller, which are rather strange works of Blake with these sort of epigrammatic lines to them. And they all sound rather fire and brimstone and rather threatening. And I think she felt that this was a good kind of tone for this book. And then she found out, by some bizarre coincidence, that several people who had translated Blake into Polish lived in this area, Kotlina Kłodzka, where the book is set and where Olga has her house, and where, incidentally, Primeval and Other Times and House of Day, House of Night are set. So it's an important place in her work. And it's a place with a sort of slightly revolutionary air to it. An awful lot of dissident types have gathered there. And it's got a sort of hippie feeling to it. And why should there be several people translating Blake all living in the same area? It is odd. And she thought that was odd. So the bit where Dizzy is translating Blake, and he's obsessed with Blake, and Janina Dushejko, who's his former school teacher, helps him. And there's this scene where they translate the same quatrain several different ways. And in Polish, the different quatrains are taken from these different real translators' works. And it was quite funny when I had to translate that. I said to Olga, I can't do anything with that. Blake is Blake, it's sacred. And then Jennifer was staying with me. And she said, in a nice sort of calm way, unlike me, she said, well, I think I would do something with that. And I thought, there's a challenge. So she encouraged me to think about it differently. And I remember having a conversation with a friend, Veronica Esposito, who's done a lot to promote translated works. And I talked to her about it. And I said, what would you think if there were different versions in English of something written in English? Does that sound mad? And she said, no, I think that sounds perfectly reasonable. So I thought, okay, I will try this. So then I had to make up bad versions of Blake because I could see that the Polish translations were a bit ho-hum, frankly. So then it was quite fun making up not Blake.
I once asked Olga Tokarczuk about I think when we were talking about Praviek on the road in the U.S. About to say a little about the Polish village, and and I'm expecting her to say something about the village as a source of of myth and so forth, and she has these characters like the wise old women who know herbology and astrology and other kind of arcana, and she had absolutely no desire to talk about that, and I realized in retrospect, that maybe a lot of those old women are I think they're inspired by her grandmother, whom she talks about in that biographical essay that she wrote for the Nobel Prize.
You see, the thing is with Olga, if you spend some time with her, you see that she's like a magpie, and she picks up interesting shiny pieces and takes them off for her collection. And I have spent a lot of time in the part of the world where she lives, and I've met some of these local characters. And I've seen how she just collects things here and there. And you couldn't ever say this is totally a reproduction of that character or this incident or that story. It's an incredibly detailed mosaic also of just pieces that have also been put through the amazing processing of Olga's mind. This is a highly imaginative person who is extremely well read, and she's extremely well read in a lot of mythologies. She's always been very interested in fairy tales and legends, and she knew Greek mythology in childhood very, very well. But she also has always read up on other mythologies, and she's extremely erudite. So I would never say that things are just coming out of some village culture with her. There's just so much going on. She's such a rich resource in herself. And the way she takes all these things and weaves them together is what makes her an extremely unusual and brilliant writer. But I have had experiences I can tell you about, if you want to know, of some of the characters and where some of these characters came from, and I have met some of these people.
Well, before we get to that, let me ask Jenny, how about, in Books of Jacob, I mean, she's writing about an area where she doesn't live, of course, in a time when she doesn't live. That I know that she traveled through Podolia and Galicia and that region as part of her research. How do you think that makes her, that work differ because it's at a distance?
It differs too much in that sense. I mean, this book, the Books of Jacob, also feels so deeply steeped in local traditions. The fact that they're not strictly speaking Olga's local traditions doesn't really change that to my mind as I read. I mean, she really immersed herself in every reading that she could find from that time, all of the historical records she could find. Admittedly, there aren't, troves and troves of them, but she did tons of research. She did do all of the travels she could to kind of make sure that she got all of the details right and all of the, smells and the sounds. And it's just so meticulous in a way that just kind of gradually builds as you read. So you really feel like you're in that world. And I don't think that in that way it's so different from her work that is more anchored in where she is originally from.
Also, there was a question in one of the interviews that in the British press for the Books of Jacob, where a journalist had said to her that there's a lot of charges of cultural appropriation nowadays among writers and so on. And she's not Jewish, so did she feel that it was appropriate for her to be writing about these Jewish characters? And she said, you can't have literature if you don't write about things that are outside your own experience. You would have nothing if everyone was limited to writing about nothing but what they know personally. And of course, she's absolutely right. What about imagination? What about erudition? What about genius?
Something that came up in the last episode, which was on a reportage, was that Małgorzata Scheinert said, "Oh, nowadays, who reads fiction? Everybody reads. People just read reportage." As I was thinking about that, I'm thinking, well, I mean, my next episode is going to be about Olga Tokarczuk, and people are certainly reading Tokarczuk. But then, really, I mean, Tokarczuk herself complicates that issue that there's truth in fiction, fiction in truth. Reportage is literature of fact, but it's more the emphasis on the literature, perhaps more than the fact. And a work like Books of Jacob is a work that relies heavily on research and historical characters who actually existed, and in some cases are put together in fictional situations.
I can't answer how she would respond to Scheinert's claim, but I mean, I think there's something so thrilling, and this is definitely one of the things that has kept me working with Olga for such a long time. one of the things that's so thrilling about her work is that each book is different, but also each book is really genuinely kind of pushing against all possible limits in terms of genre. Like if you look at Flights, which I also translated, it's many people feel like it's not even really a novel. And one of the reasons why it did take so long to find a publisher for it in English is that every editor I talked to said, basically, like, what the hell is this? It's a bunch of fragments. Some of them are really slow. It's not apparent how they fit together. You have, again, some things that feel like nonfiction, some things that feel a little bit like philosophy, some things that feel a little bit like reportage, and then some things that are very clearly fiction, more traditional short stories or connected novellas or whatever. So, I love that she's both very playful, but also so deeply ambitious in that really genuine sense, without any pretentiousness. She's just always exploring at the limits of what literature can do. And I don't think that she doesn't worry in the way that so many authors at her level of success worry about, like, how is this going to hit the market or whatever. That's not her concern.
Witkatze said that he described the novel as a sack, worek, that you can throw everything into that, and it does seem that in some, and especially in like a work like like the books of Jacob, it's not that she's throwing everything in there, but it's a kind of a vessel that can absorb every genre. I mean, it's epistolary, it's picaresque, it's diary, it's sometimes fairly straightforward third-person narration, and then there's this tender narrator, this character of Yenta, who is maybe we should say, if we haven't really set up either of these works, maybe we should do that first. Do you want to, Jenny? Do you want to set up Books of Jacob and tell people what it's about? Give the one line, the 1 minute plot summary.
The Books of Jacob is really about the community surrounding Jacob Frank, which includes his followers and the people who hated him. Jacob Frank was a real historical figure in the 18th century. He led his followers kind of around Eastern and Central Europe and the Ottoman Empire. They converted at various times to Islam and to Catholicism from Judaism. They had a lot of very strange seeming practices, strange seeming to Poles and to others. And they were very controversial. They became increasingly controversial the more followers he gained. And yet they were also quite influential. And I think, they speak to one of Olga's interests here is this Poland that used to exist that doesn't really exist anymore, that was multilingual, multicultural, multi-ethnic. And this was a time when all of these people were kind of intersecting and clashing, but also coming up with interesting ideas together. So it's just, she built a whole world that, is in parallel to a world that really did exist in the 18th century.
Why did Antonia, can you, so that our readers can follow the what we're talking about, set up Drive Your Plow in the same way?
Well, while Olga Tokarczuk was writing the Books of Jacob, in order to fulfill a condition of her publishing contract, she needed to deliver a novel by a certain date. So she took a break from her enormous research and writing work and wrote somehow this wonderful novel described on its back as an existential thriller. And it takes the genre of crime writing and puts a new twist on it, because the book is narrated by a woman in her mid to late 60s who is a reclusive character who lives in a remote Polish village in her retirement, where she prefers the company of animals to people, and where various strange things start to happen. And some of the local men who are important as perhaps within the police, people of authority, men who are important within authority in the local area, are found dead in strange circumstances. And our eccentric narrator, the heroine of the book, is convinced that the murders are being committed by animals as vengeance for hunting. And so the book is partly about madness. It's partly about how people who are rather eccentric are marginalized, how women of a certain age are marginalized, about how animals don't have any rights, and about the hypocrisy of religion in Poland. So as a result, it caused quite a stir because it was a book that passed political comment in an oblique way. And I'm very bad at talking about it, as you can tell.
Oh, you talk about it very well, if I may say so. It was a book that I'm thinking, thriller, not my genre, but when it first came out, but it really is. But I thought, well, if I'm going to like a thriller, probably it's going to be a thriller by Olga Tokarczuk, and it's also people call it an eco thriller because it concerns itself with ecology. And it is really a wonderful genre bending book. She talks in her Nobel speech about doubts that she has about genre fiction. So it's interesting that she decides to play with this. How did you? I mean, the voice of Duszejko is really wonderfully crafted and translated. How did you find that voice? I mean, you say it's within yourself, and perhaps it has to be, but.
Well, I mean, this is one of the great joys of writing, of translating such a very competent, confident writer, because as Olga herself says, writing in the first person is in a way easier because you find that voice and then you simply stick with it. And I always think of translating first person narrative in a similar way. It's a bit like, rather than driving myself, I'm traveling on the tram. Once I get on that tram, I just follow the tracks. And with Duszejko, at first, in Polish, I think she's a bit more stylized. And I first translated it, giving her a slightly more eccentric tone. And then when I'd finished the whole thing, something felt wrong. So something felt completely wrong. So I went right back to the beginning. I kind of stepped back from it and then looked at it again and realized that it worked as it was in Polish with this very stylized, bizarre voice of this woman. But perhaps it's that English and particularly British literature has a lot of very eccentric characters. And in order for this book to work, the reader needs to become complicit with the main character and needs to want to stick with her through 250 pages. And to feel that they want to know what she has to say beyond page 5. And I realized that if it was over stylized, she'd be too annoying and they wouldn't want to stick with her. So I went right through the whole translation and it felt like I was reining her in. I was just flattening that style out a little bit. And it was very interesting. When I came to record the UK audiobook, I did the reading. And the same thing happened. People had liked my readings and at events. And when I started doing the recording, I read her as I had at those readings in a slightly eccentric style. I sort of acted her. And the producer said after a couple of chapters, she said, I'm not sure this is going to work. And I was always thinking, I don't know if I can keep this up. And then I said to her, can we have a break? And I'll come back in a few days when I've really let this settle. And we started all over again. And the second time around, I simply read it as me. And it worked much, much, much better because I was adding a layer of interpretation, first on the page and then as a reader, that was actually going to put the reader off. So it was about finding her voice in English, and that meant taking an ever so slightly different approach to her. Janina Dushejko, our narrator and heroine, gives strange nicknames to all the people she encounters. And so her neighbour, who she's quite fond of, is a man whom she calls Oddball. And they both live in this remote village in a rather strange, reclusive way. I don't know what Oddball does through the dark months, because we're not in very close contact, though I won't hide it, I would have hoped for more. We see each other once every few days, and when we do, we exchange a few words in greeting. We didn't move here for the purpose of inviting each other to tea. Oddball bought his house a year after I bought mine, and it looks as if he'd decided to start a new life, like anyone whose ideas and means for the old one have run out. Apparently he worked at a circus, but I don't know if he was an accountant there or an acrobat. I prefer to think he was an acrobat, and whenever he limps, I imagine that long ago in the beautiful 1970s, during a special act, something happened that caused his hand to miss the bar, and he fell from a height onto the sawdust-sprinkled floor. But on further reflection, I must admit that accountancy isn't such a bad profession, and the fondness for order that's typical of the accountant inspires my approval and total respect. Oddball's fondness for order is plain to see in his small front yard. The firewood for the winter lies piled in ingenious cords arranged in a spiral. The result is a neat stack of golden proportions. Those cords of his could be regarded as a local work of art. I find it hard to resist their beautiful spiral order. Whenever I pass that way, I always stop a while to admire the constructive cooperation of hands and mind, which in such a trivial thing as firewood expresses the most perfect motion in the universe. The path in front of Oddball's house is so very neatly gravelled that it looks like a special kind of gravel, a collection of identical pebbles hand-picked in a rocky underground factory run by hobgoblins. Every fold of the clean curtains hanging in the windows is exactly the same width. He must use a special device for that. And the flowers in his garden are neat and tidy, standing straight and slender, as if they'd been to the gym. Now, as Oddball bustled about in his kitchen, I could see how tidily the glasses were lined up in his dresser, and what a spotless cloth lay over the sewing machine. So he even had a sewing machine. Shamefully, I pressed my hands between my knees. It was a long time since I had devoted any special care to them. Oh well, I have the courage to admit that my fingernails were quite simply dirty. As he fetched the teaspoons for a brief moment, his drawer was revealed to me, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It was wide and shallow, like a tray. Inside, carefully arranged in separate compartments, lay all sorts of cutlery and other utensils needed in the kitchen. Each one had its place, though most of them were quite unfamiliar to me. Oddball's bony fingers purposefully chose 2 teaspoons that soon came to rest on willow green napkins right beside our teacups. A little too late, unfortunately, for I had already drunk my tea. It was hard to have a conversation with Oddball. He was a man of very few words, and as it was impossible to talk, one had to keep silent. It's hard work talking to some people, most often males. I have a theory about it. With age, many men come down with testosterone autism, the symptoms of which are a gradual decline in social intelligence and capacity for interpersonal communication, as well as a reduced ability to formulate thoughts. The person beset by this ailment becomes taciturn and appears to be lost in contemplation. He develops an interest in various tools and machinery, and he's drawn to the Second World War and the biographies of famous people, mainly politicians and villains. His capacity to read novels almost entirely vanishes. Testosterone autism disturbs the character's psychological understanding. I think Oddball was suffering from this ailment.
That's a wonderful description. Do you think that, and a fine reading, I should say, do you think that that Dusheko, like Yenta in Books of Jacob, is kind of this tender narrator, sensitive narrator, fourth person narrator who sees from above, or not at all?
No, I don't think that's the intention here. She's a quite different kind of narrator.
She's very different in that regard, but she does know everything that's going on, you know.
But what you have to remember is that, can you rely on her? I don't think she's the most reliable of narrators. You get her take on things, but by the end of the book, perhaps you might revise your sense of trust in her reliability.
That could happen, I think. And Jenny, would you like to read a passage from the Books of Jacob? Before our meeting, we talked about this wonderful description that's itself very poetic, both in the original and I think in the translation, of this moment when one conflict between the Orthodox Jews and the Frankists, the followers of Jacob Frank, is that the Frankists reject the Talmud, and they decide to have a burning of the Talmuds, which will result in a burning of the Kabbalistic texts like the Zohar later on in the novel. But it struck me as like almost a genre unto itself. This picture of the burning Talmuds. Would you like to read that?
So the mini chapter is called Of Burning Books. The Talmuds begin to burn that very same day, October 14th, in the evening. Those carrying out the sentences find they don't have to exert themselves too much. Only the first pile, the one in Kamieniec, is formally ignited by the local hangman after a reading of the order signed by Bishop Dembowski. From then on, things run their course. In most cases, a small crowd breaks into a Jewish home and gets its hands on some book. All of these Talmuds, with their impure pages written in that twisted alphabet that goes from right to left, are instantly tossed out onto the street, where they get kicked into a heap, which then gets set on fire. The Sabbatians themselves, the Jewish heretics, are exceptionally eager to help the officials, who, being thus relieved of their duties, may go home and have their dinners. And then the Goyim and the young men, always looking for trouble, join in with the Sabbatians. Books burn throughout Lviv, where every square of any significance has its own book burning, whether Talmudic or not. These fires are still smoldering the next day, and then in the evening they blaze back up again with the addition of new books. Now all printed matter seems sinister, and even Lviv's Christians begin to hide their books and barricade their printing presses just in case. Over the course of only a few days, all this burning so emboldens everyone that the Kamieniec Jews, who have made this town home, irrespective of the law, have once more begun to move on with all their belongings, this time to Karvasari, fearing for their lives. The sight of the burning books, their pages fluttering in the flames, draws people in, arrays them in a circle, like a magician at a fair who has ordered chickens to do as he says. People gaze into the flames and find they like this theater of destruction, and a free-floating anger mounts within them, although they don't know whom to turn it on. But their outrage more or less automatically makes them hostile to the owners of these ruined books. Now one whoop would suffice to send the frenzied crowd into the nearest Jewish residence that the Contra-Talmudist guards, hoping to prevent the plunder of their own homes, might direct them toward. Those who were only recently considered wretched, sinful, and accursed have now become legislators and enforcers, and vice versa. Those who formerly judged and instructed now find themselves judged and instructed. The rabbi's place is no longer the home of a rabbi, but a public house that all can enter, opening the door with the force of their feet. Inside, you pay no mind to shrieks of protest and instead proceed directly to the place you know books are usually kept, often in a glass case, and you pull them out one by one and then eviscerate them, holding them by their covers like chickens before they are boiled. Some woman, often the oldest one in the house, throws herself in front of the books in desperation as though defending a weird, disabled grandchild who has been reduced to these paper dimensions. But the rest of the household is afraid to oppose the violence, evidently knowing already that the capricious forces of the world have switched sides for who knows how long. Sometimes the women make their way to one of the ringleaders, and sometimes he's a cousin misguided by the Sabbatian idea, and they take his hand and try desperately to catch his eye. Itzela, what are you doing? Your mother and I used to play together down by the river. The elders mutter from the corner. Your hand will wither and drop off for this sacrilege. In Busk, there aren't so many Talmuds to burn, given how few Talmudists are left here. Most people are followers of Sabbatai. A little fire burns behind the synagogue, but it burns badly, smoking, since the books fell into a puddle and now don't seem to want to catch fire. They don't have the same determination here. Those doing the burning act as if they're carrying out a sentence. A bottle of vodka makes its way around the fire. Young goyim try to get in on the auto da fe, throwing anything on flames always appeals to them, even if they don't really know what's happening. But they have already heard that this is some internal matter of the Jews. So now they stand around with their hands in their pockets of their linen trousers and just gaze into the blaze.
That's a good stopping point, I think, because it's almost like it seems like a climax of this, kind of perverse dance that's happening. That there's a whole genre of this kind of carnivalesque literature in Polish, and I'm thinking of works like Julian Tuwim's Ball at the Opera, Bal w Operze, Józef Witlin's Hymn of Hatred, which is not as well known. Hymn Nienawiści. There are other works like this, like Schulz's Wichura, the Gale, that describes, on one reading, is considered to be a description of a pogrom that happens, and outside of, and in Russian, there's Babel's Story of My Dovecote, which is another work that has this kind of building frenzied quality. What was it like translating something like that? Do you read it out loud to yourself? Do you, how do you get that sense of rhythm?
What you're saying about the building into a frenzy applies to the whole novel, which is one of the things that makes the novel work so well. So even though it's 1,000 pages long, it does very quickly develop this momentum and this kind of relentlessness that reminds me a lot of Roberto Bolaño's big novels like 2666, which is one of my favorite novels. And I think the thing that caught me by surprise a little bit about translating it, I always find Olga's work very moving, and I do usually get very emotionally involved in the work that I'm translating. But this was hard. I mean, there were days where I just felt awful after working on this book because it's so filled with violence and deplorable acts. And there are some things that are just really hard to read, and then to write them again in a new language feels even harder. My husband, Boris Streluk, translated The Story of My Dovecote by Babel, and I think had kind of a similar experience. He's like Babel, he's Jewish and from Odessa. And I think, the closer you are to these characters, whether by virtue of kind of innate qualities or by identification, the harder it can be to render these passages with the restraint that is necessary that Antonia was describing for Drive Your Plow.
Translating something just so big, I'm thinking about how one approaches as a reader, just, reading books like the books of Jacob, like War and Peace, or, the things that James called loose baggy monsters, that it's almost as if forgetting part of it is sort of part of the experience of reading. I mean, that there's no way to keep the whole book in your head ever. And that must change your experience as somebody who's translating it. I mean, you're more involved certainly than any of the readers because you spent 7 years with it, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, I translated many other books and wrote books during that time, but I kept coming back to it, as I'm sure I will continue to do forever. But I mean, as someone who also writes fiction, I think it is so hard to keep a whole book in mind as you're working on it. And it does kind of consume. When I was fully immersed in this, especially toward the end of the translation process, which was right after Olga won the Nobel Prize, it did kind of edge out everything else that could have been in my brain. And I was fully living inside this book. But then, kind of like Olga, when it's over, it's over. I will go back to it, but I'm no longer in it.
Let me ask you both. What's next on the agenda? What else are you working on? Both, Jenny, I know you've written your own novel and a memoir, and you both have lots of translation projects all the time. And what's on the agenda for translating the rest of Olga's works? When's that all going to happen?
Well, I've been doing a bit of Olga's nonfiction. There's an essay. This is thanks to Jenny, who set this up. But there's going to be an essay of hers called The Masks of Animals. It's going to be published in Freeman's. I don't know quite when, but they're doing an animals issue. And it's an interesting piece. It talks about animal rights within certain literary works by J.M. Coetzee and Michel Faber, among others. That was an interesting thing to translate. And then I think Olga has recently, or is completing, a short-ish novel, which I think uses the horror genre, if I've understood right. And I suppose one or other of us is probably going to be translating that one of these days. But I don't know what the program is exactly.
Yeah, because we also have this plan to co-translate two of her recent collections, her collection of essays and her collection of short stories. So we've kind of provisionally divided those up, and we're ready to work on them probably pretty soon, but we'll see what happens with the various publishers.
We're not always responsible for these decisions because there's agents and publishers and people kind of planning out what happens next. So we just go with the flow.
So what else are you both working on outside of Olga's work?
I'm currently translating a few writers from Argentina. I just finished a book called Two Sherpas by Sebastián Martínez Daniel. And I'm working on a very short work, almost like a prose poetry collection, but it's called a novella by Silvia Molloy. And then after that, I'll be translating Federico Falco's novel, The Plains. And then I'm also working on my own novel, which is called Amadou, which is set in the Białowieża forest and village, which is a place that I really love and am very inspired by, but also haunted by. And I got to visit a few times, most recently this past summer. So I'm eager to get back to that. I've been doing a lot of teaching this semester, but I have a few residencies coming up, and hopefully I'll get to finish that.
Antonia?
Well, I'm finally working on something I've been boring everybody about for years, but I'm finally doing it, which is an anthology of stories set in Warsaw. And in fact, there's going to be one by Olga in there, which is called Che Guevara. And it's a story about the experiences she had. This is a bit of a personal story. I think it probably really did happen to her. I must find out. But she had to actually do some clinical psychotherapy as a student. And she was given the task of taking care of certain patients. And it describes how during the student strikes of the 1980s in Warsaw, she was looking after this man with all sorts of strange delusions who was nicknamed Che Guevara, and how he, in a paranoid fit, locked her in his flat for a couple of days. So that, I hope, is going to be in my Warsaw anthology. That's the one I'm going to do next for it. I've already done about half the book. And then I've been asked to put together the Penguin Book of Polish Short Stories, which is the first comprehensive anthology of Polish literature for a long time. And there's Jennifer, I was going to be recruited here because there's a story of Olga's that I'm interested in including in that collection, which is one that is kind of out there on its own, not in any of her collections. And I was thinking that this would be a good place for it. So, Jennifer, I'll be commissioning you.
It's like one of those marriage proposals that takes place on live television.
Exactly.
Well, so I'm glad to be the venue.
Yeah, yes, very nice. You're the matchmaker here. And so I've been doing a lot of work to try to decide what should go. This is such an opportunity to promote all sorts of authors who haven't necessarily appeared in English very much. And I was in Poland a few months ago talking to various critics and people who are well placed to help advise me on what should be in this book. And I still haven't cast it in stone, but I'm gradually working on that, reading a vast amount of short stories.
Are they going to be mostly contemporary or a mixture of historic and contemporary?
I think it's going to go back no more than 100 years from now. So, but I mean, I keep thinking Prouse's stories are awfully good, but he's in my Warsaw collection. It's extremely difficult. With the Warsaw collection, I kind of straitjacketed myself into certain criteria. So with this one, I'm trying to keep it nice and elastic. So I have a lot of, I can keep changing my mind about things, but I'm still not fully sure about anything yet. Watch this space.
Okay, Jenny, you say you're teaching now. Could you one thing that we like to talk about at the end of each show is opportunities to study with our guests. So, do you have any coming up? Any mentorships you do, or writing programs you'll be teaching at?
I have been teaching yearly these translation workshops at ALTA, which is the American Literary Translators Association. They've been online the last 2 years. Those are really fun. There's a way to register for them when you register for the conference, but I really enjoyed those, and I've gotten incredibly good students. I mean, people who are professional translators. It's just a great time to have a conversation about our work. And I've also been teaching for Breadloaf, their translation workshop, which happens in June every year, and which has been online, maybe in person this year. So I've done a number of these translation workshops, and I definitely will continue doing them. So that would be something to look for.
Antonia, I know you do a lot of mentoring. So,
well, I've also been an ALTA workshop leader recently, which is great fun, as Jennifer said. I had the most extraordinary Zoom event, with people participating across the globe from Seattle all the way to Jordan. It was awesome. Anyway, but I'm also, for the 10th year in a row, mentoring for the British National Centre for Writing emerging translator mentorship program. And my current mentee, we've just done a month with, we're just about to actually meet physically because she's called Jess Jensen Mitchell, and she is doing her PhD at Harvard, which is where I'm speaking to you from, Harvard University. So I've been working with her, and that's very exciting. And I hope we'll be going to Poland together in January. So business as usual for my mentorships.
That's wonderful. So I would like to thank you both for being on the program. It's great, talking to both of you, and I'm sure that we will have more opportunities in the future. I'd like to remind our viewers to remember to subscribe and click the bell to receive notifications about new videos from the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. Go to the Polish Cultural Institute's website linked in the description below to see a full schedule of upcoming episodes. I'd like to thank all the people who helped make this series possible. Our sponsor, the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, directed by Robert Szaniawski. Bartek Remisko, Head of Humanities and Literature at the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, suggested this series and acts as our executive producer. My fellow producer, Natalia Iudin, handles all the video editing, technical, and aesthetic aspects of this production. Klaudia Ofłona-Draber, Head of Communications at the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, keeps us all informed about upcoming episodes of Encounters with Polish Literature and other events organized by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. Thank you all for listening and reading along with us. Let's meet again in a month, when we'll be chatting again with Professor Beth Holmgren from Duke University about the contemporary Polish school of reportage, focusing on Philip Springer's tale of a Polish town that disappeared, and Katarzyna Boni's account of the earthquake and tsunami in Fukushima, Japan, and its aftermath. See you then.